Well, this is what the text says. Jesus takes Peter, John and James into the hills to pray, and while they were there, Moses and Elijah appeared and speak to Jesus. I had an Old Testament professor, one of my heroes. He wasn't very bright. He just managed to accumulate a Master of Arts, a Master of Science, a Master of Education, a Doctor of Divinity, and a Doctor of Philosophy. Otherwise, he was just a fairly ordinary person who could read 16 languages. But the most common answer he gave to a question was, "I don't know." So anyway, when I ask you, what did it really mean? What did really happen? Well, I don't know. But there's a lovely story about an army officer and his son who was stationed in Khartoum in the country, Sudan. And in the marketplace in Khartoum there was a statue of the famous general, General Gordon, seated on a camel. And over the years the young boy had got quite accustomed to seeing this and he fell in love with it. Well, the time came when the lights started to go out all over Europe, and the army officer was summoned back to England. And so they went into the marketplace for one last look at Gordon on the camel. They stood and looked and stared, and finally the father said to his son, "Well, son, we've got to go. You better say goodbye to Gordon." And the boy said, "Goodbye, Gordon," and turned to walk away, and then turned back, and with a sob in his voice he said, "Dad, who's the man on Gordon's back?" And I sometimes wonder whether that's what we've done to the Christian faith. We've become more concerned about the camel than the rider. There are people who see the Christian faith as a moral code, a code of behaviour. This is what you've got to do. And I guess if you look at this story, we could say that Moses represents the law. On Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments were given, 8 of which are negative. And so much more of what follows in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy is negative. You know the story. Go and see what your brother's doing and tell him to stop it. There's a lovely story told by Joy Davidman. Now, she is probably more famous because she's so often referred to as C.S. Lewis's wife. But she was a scholar and a writer in her own line. And she tells the story of a missionary in Africa who'd been trying hard to convert the native chief. And now the chief was very old and the missionary was very Old Testament. His version of Christianity was like that of the camel. And the savage listened, and then he said, "I do not understand. You tell me that I must not take my neighbour's wife." That's right. "Or his ivory or his oxen." That's right. "I must not dance the war dance and then ambush men on the trail and kill them." That's right. "But I cannot do any of these things," said the man. "I'm too old." To be old and to be a Christian, they are the same thing. The camel or the rider? Well, that's how I was brought up. In my church, there was no drinking, no smoking, no dancing, no films. I remember when I was in theological college, my mate and I snuck out into the little picture theatre in Ashfield to see The Student Prince. Boy, and I felt so guilty about it. What if someone saw me? No golf on Sundays, no Sunday papers, no cards, no makeup. And to this day I don't wear makeup. We're told that Jesus went to the synagogue and was called Rabbi, but again and again Jesus said to those who would listen, Moses said this, but I say something quite different. Now in the New Testament we meet the Pharisees at their worst. They were a holiness movement, they were zealously religious, they were keen and zealous, and they did what most of us would not do. They prayed and fasted and tithed and kept the law. But that was a whole lot easier than loving your enemies, wasn't it? And they were old-fashioned, narrow, bigoted, and they did not believe that the Lord had yet more light and truth to break forth from his word. And Jesus said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. It always saddens me when people leave a church, and they wouldn't leave this church, but people who leave a church because they weren't prepared to go along with what the minister was saying, and they weren't prepared to stretch their minds. And it reminds me that belief can be the camel. Belief is not faith. Doug and I have talked about one of the great old preachers, Jonathan Edwards. What a name. Jonathan Edwards used to dangle his congregation over the pit of hell. And he once preached a sermon on sinners in the hands of an angry God. And one of the church officers had to crawl down the aisle and come to him and say, for God's sake, look at your congregation, because they saw themselves dangling over the pit of hell, about to be drawn into it. But Jonathan Edwards said, I observe that old men seldom have any advantages of new discoveries, because those discoveries are different from a way of thinking that they have long been used to. Resolved that if I live to years, I will be impartial to hear the reason of all pretended discoveries. That's pretty good for a man with that kind of outlook, isn't it? So there was Moses, and he could represent the law, and there was Elijah, and he would represent the prophets. He's another important figure in the Jewish faith. Who do people say that I am? Jesus once asked, and one of the answers given was they saying you're Elijah? At the crucifixion, some people thought that Jesus was calling out for Elijah. But there was a yawning gulf between what Jesus stood for and what Elijah stood for. If you read on into Luke chapter 9, James and John wanted to call down fire from heaven to burn up people who wouldn't accept them. And they quoted Elijah. That's what Elijah would have done. Elijah believed that God worked through lightning and cyclones and noise and wrath and terror and destruction. That's how God works. And it was only when he came to see that a still, small voice can carry much further than din and tumult. Are spiritual forces more potent than material things? God's way is often to steal into the world secretly and unannounced. Thomas Carlyle, he must have been having a bad day, once said, I can only believe in a God who does something and he does nothing. Well, certainly not in our noisy, vulgar, self-advertising way. Even John the Baptist had his doubts. Are you the one that we were to expect, or must we look for another? And Jesus sends back the answer. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised from the dead, the good news is preached, and happy is the person who never loses faith in me. Don't they? Sometimes spiritual things seem so slow. My inspiration from long ago was Arthur John Gossip, who was a chaplain in the First World War. And he talks of walking through a village and coming across a group of monks who were praying. And he felt so angry. Why aren't they doing something? And had to ask himself the question as a minister of the gospel, what good is prayer? Do something, that's what we want. But what if I have to fall back on God? Well, we can have a faith that is based on what Elijah thought, and we can fill our church with din and clamour, and God's voice can't reach us. There are times when we need to be still and know that God is God. So how does the story end? Two things. A voice says, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." And if we got nothing more from this service today, that would be wonderful. This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him. And there was nobody to be seen but Jesus. Jesus said, "I have come that you may have life and have it in all its fullness." Quentin Hogg worked with young people in London, dealing with kids who were on the wrong side of the tracks. And he wrote a letter to one of these boys later on in life and said, "I do not care a rush what denomination you belong to. I do not very much care what special creed you profess, but I do dare beyond all expression that the result of that creed in your daily life should be to make you a power for good among your fellows." We hear much about creeds, professions of faith and the like, but I want you to remember that when God started to write a creed for us, God did it not in words that might change their meaning, but set before us a life, as though to teach that whereas theology was a science which could be argued about, religion was a life that could only be lived. My word for you today is the word from Herbert Butterfield, the great historian. Hold fast to Christ, and for the rest, be totally uncommitted. Amen.